We are possessed by a question, an archetypal one. What are we doing here? Search for being. Animals don't question their existence. Something within us make us feel as if something needs to be set right. Redemption. Years ago, people saw the world through lenses of belief. And it's inevitable, because your limited cognitive processor. You have to frame your perceptions with beliefs. Are structured by religious. Religious presupposition is one that you might even know, and not notice that you make it. It's a predicate, axiom or assumption. And the study of those axiomatic assumptions is what religion is about. Like, one of your axiomatic assumptions is, life involves a search for meaning, that's associated with the idea of redemption. We all ask that question. It's something profound about human nature, its lack of completion. The Bible, it's designed by processes that we don't really understand, because we don't know how books are written over thousands of years. Or what forces caused them to be compiled in a certain way. Bible, it actually has a narrative structure, has a story, that story being cobbled together. It's a bottom-up story. A book that was revealed rather than one that was written. It's full of stories that no one can forget, but that no one can understand. Genesis. Why you need to search for meaning. Start with the Word of God creating being from chaos. The word is logos, something like consciousness/speech. Has the power to pull order out of chaos. That's why we're made in the image of God. We use our consciousness to constantly construct being out of chaos. And that's akin to the construction of the world. So, consciousness itself plays a world-constructing role. And humans participate in that. Once Logos extracts order out of chaos, he builds a little world. And he populates it. Then puts the paradise equals walled garden. Or Eden equals well-watered place. And, a garden is the optimal combination of nature and culture, or chaos and order, a safe and controlled environment, that it's optimal for people. He says, now you are in the garden. That's where you should lay. But there's something you shouldn't do. Which is, eat a particular fruit. Let me tell you, humans have excellent vision. We see color, it's tremendously acute. Maybe because, our ancestors were frequently preyed upon by snakes. And there's some evidence that our tree-dwelling ancestors and snakes co-evolved. And we are good to seek for patterns of camouflage that snakes used to hide. And where there were more predatory snakes, the primates could see better. So, human beings can see so well, because of snakes. We don't know where the Adam and Eve history came about. But that sticks in our memory and in our culture. Because in some strange way, it's an extraordinarily accurate summation. What about the fruit? Our visual system evolved to detect ripe fruit. What about women? You have to be pretty wake to outsmart a woman. They also were gatherers, they shared food with men. So, women did tempt men with fruit. And they did make them self-conscious, along with the snake and the fruit. And that was a catastrophe. Because when people become self-conscious, by eating the fruit, their vision improves, in a way that no other animal has ever seen. So, they realize they were naked, and that's a big problem. And to be naked is to have all your frailties and vulnerabilities revealed to judgment. So, to become self-aware is to wake up into a nightmare. Involves to profound realization of individual vulnerability. Then, they were banished from paradise. And are from then on in need of redemption. And they have to work. That's how man comes to be in a fallen state. Everyone has this intuition, that they're in a fallen state. That something is wrong with the world that need to be put right. And that they have a moral obligation to participate in that process. It's beneath what drives us, it's an axiomatic presupposition. The next thing is Cain and Abel. First people that are born in history. History of jealous resentment against God, followed by murder. That it's the first pattern that human manifest once they become self-conscious. And say that there are two patterns of reaction to tragic self-consciousness. One, murderous state of resentment towards life. Two, the establishment of the antithesis of murderous resentment. Hell and heaven. Then, Noah flood. Nature comes in, tears everything down. And the Tower of Babel is erected. That's a meditation on pride. People build a structure that reaches up where God is. Bible rise consistent warnings against the sin of pride. Is an intellectual sin, associated with the presupposition? You know enough to do without the transcendent. And that it's catastrophically dangerous. That you always have to be aware that there's something transcendent that supersedes the domain of your knowledge. And people that don't believe that become totalitarians, they believe that their belief is total. So, people create something on earth like hell. And that was hammered home in 20th century. Totalitarian states and ideologies are not a good way you search after meaning. After flood, it's where history really starts. It's kind of a classic hero myth. Associated with the establishment of states. The great heroes of the past, our forefathers, who established the state. That describes the patterns that characterize how the state was founded. Abraham and Jacob. Involved in the establishment of the polity of the actual state. Once the state is established, people get off course, the leadership as well. So collapses into a state of chaos. Then, a prophetic revelation, warning of that danger. Then, a terrible period of chaotic disruption. Then, the regeneration of the state. Foreshadowed by Exodus, Moses' story. Egypt is a tyranny. A leader rises to pull everyone out of tyranny. Chaotic interlude, wandering in the desert. The re-establishment of the state. Archetypal pattern. Happens to everything. You are in your system of belief. Something rises, like a snake, to disrupt it. Because the state is insufficiently adapted to the environment. It doesn't have all the answers, it ages and becomes corrupt. It's prone to collapse. A catastrophe. Like, happens when your dream is shattered, encounter a great tragedy. Someone dies. Or diagnosed with a dangerous illness. That event is analogous to the snake. The same circuits in your brain to detect things that go wrong. Things are always going wrong. Then, they were seeking for the establishment of another state. That we hope will be a better state. Where everyone finally will be happy. That's our utopian dream. You are either in a state of order or a state of chaos. The state itself starts to become apparent. It's established and then collapses, over and over, it's never permanent. The state itself is flawed, it cannot provide the final answer to question what constitutes genuine redemption. The communists and Nazis claimed that the state was the final answer. That's a tremendously flawed idea, that can be pursued so hard by people with narrow viewpoints, that the state itself become murderous. Then, it's the book of Job. Tormented in all sort of ways. All bad happens to him. And can't understand why. It's like a final state of unredeemed. The states are not the answer. So, if being is order, being is chaos. And if chaos and the state is intolerable, and order, it's not the answer, what it's left. That's the question the New Testament attempts to solve. One of the problem of the URSS was the inability to correct errors. Starts with a hypothesis about what constituted the truth. That structures your life. It's very difficult to make the micro-corrections that a state has to make on a continual basis, in order to remain dynamic and fluid. So, in order to stay adapted to reality, not only you have to have a viewpoint, but, to engage in a process of modifying that viewpoint. So you need minor adjustments as a consequence of paying attention. Example, you are having a conversation. You can impose on that person your viewpoint. But, you are not having a conversation. You just want to impose a viewpoint, that you already hold, to the own person that's listening. If you are a tyrant, they'll do that and pay no attention to the person's response. And even you'll become violent if the person doesn't accept your framing. The alternative is to pay attention and to listen. And that person might tell you something you don't know. But in order to listen, you have to be convinced that the little theory you're using to orient yourself in the world isn't good enough. If it was good enough, then why would you bother listening? Deeply aware of your ignorance, that's what humility means. It doesn't mean to slink around in a shamed manner. Make the presupposition that you may still have something left to learn, and that person might have something to teach you, if you would just listen. A problem it's a time when the things you think aren't working. So you're discussing it, and the other person offers his opinion. You can brush it off, so your state stays intact and doesn't move. Or you can listen, and see that there's a micro-correction that you need to make in one of the peripheral elements of your beliefs. That's a little painful. Because you have to let something go. Your presumption. Then a little chaotic, as you adjust to the new information. And then reconstitute yourself. That means that you have to make a sacrifice. And God likes sacrifices, if they are of the proper kind. The one that you made of your micro-belief when you are faced with evidence of error. If you make those micro-sacrifices, then God stays pleased with you. Because your models of the world stay up to date. Like, in the old times. Why does God want burnt lamb smoke? The ancestors were dramatizing something. That there are things you can do to your being. That can change the nature of reality, and if you do them properly, you can make reality better. They figured out that if things weren't going right you had to sacrifice something valuable, that seems to make God happy. For modern people it's more like an idea. Sacrifice an idea that you hold dear, in order or progress. Your goal, dear, is exactly what is making you suffer, if you're suffering. In consequence you enter into this little period of chaos and maybe you pop out of that, and you might get out better. The process of being in the state and identifying an error and correcting it. That's a little death and rebirth. Like the phoenix. The idea in the New Testament is that you have to identify with a person who continually dies and is reborn. So redemption itself is not the consequence of being in a state. Is to be participating in a process. The willingness to continually have yourself sacrificed-chaotic-reborn. That what keeps things alive. The story of Christ is predicated on the assumption that the person who is making the ultimate sacrifices performs another number of acts. And one is a disciplined apprenticeship. In order to reconstitute your ideas, you have to have ideas. You have to be a master of something before you are formed at all. And take that burden. Like Pinocchio. The last challenge to become a real boy is to rescue his father. To rescue your father means to make peace with your culture and to embody it. And then not assume that that's absolute. It's a necessary process of discipline. The ultimate sacrifice is the sacrifice of yourself to God. Requires a different order of being. Not to sacrifice yourself to God. God is an ineffable representation of the highest possible value. Is the same as determining that your life will be guided by the unshakable commitment to the highest good. It's no longer your state that is in charge, or your ego, but even you. It means that the conversations with people are no longer going to be about convincing them that your viewpoint is right. Instead is about attempting to represent what you believe to be true in the most concise and clear possible manner, no matter what. And that's not how people live. People live like a totalitarian conniving. The idea that the world should be the way that I want it to be. And I'm going to be very angry when the world doesn't respond the way I wanted to. And maybe I would be violent as a consequence of it. And people think that they will be redeemed in a tropical beach. It's a narrow and totalitarian viewpoint. Then I sacrifice everything to that. And that's a bad idea, because things don't turn out that way, the way I want them to turn out. The alternative, it's in the Sermon on the Mount, represents a transformation from the idea that morality is constituted by adherence to a set of rules. Morality being aimed at something that you think is a positive good, is not merely not doing what's wrong. It's something else. It's sacrificing yourself in the attempt to make things better. Not by aiming at what's better, but by telling what's true. And assuming that if you do that, then what's better will happen. In 20th century people aimed at a circumscribed definition of what constitutes the utopian state. And the result was endless hell. We have to pursue what's good, but we don't know what good is. So how we get out of that paradox? Well, it isn't a matter of gathering more knowledge, it's a matter of approaching reality in a different manner. And it's an act of faith. Like Kierkegaard said, if you decide that you're going to pursue the highest good, it means that you are willing to transform what your conception of the highest good is. You aim determines the world you live in. That's a fact, a psychological fact. What you aim at determines the nature of your world. And, to aim at the wrong, equals hamartia, that means sin. Because hamartia, which is an archery term, which means, to miss the target, is what sin means, miss the target. So, if you're not in a state of grace it means your aim's wrong. Or the alternative viewpoint is that the world is against you. So you got to get your aim right, aim at the best. Once you get your aim right and you decide to tell the truth, then, all you give to do, is to concentrate on the day. On the Sermon of the Mount. The presumption is that you're aiming at a perfection, whatever perfection is. And you're not trying to get other people to do that. You're aiming at it. You're reconstituting your actions and your speech to aim at that. You do that, by noticing very carefully and attending to what constitutes the truth. And you let that take you wherever it will go. And that's the sacrifice of self to God. The truth is a representation of whatever constitutes reality. Your best attempt. And to follow that, follow something that's transcendental. To speak the truth is to be guided by being. It's a completely different mode of being. We know that human can turn the world into hell. If you studied history, you have no doubt about that. And no matter how bad you think the hell that people have created in the past is, if you read a little more history, you will find something even more terrible. We are afraid that our misbehavior will turn the world into hell. So, we believe that we can create earth into hell. But, do we believe that we can turn the world into heaven? It's a harder thing. There's a lot more ways that things could go wrong than there are ways that things can go right. So heaven is a much narrower thing to aim at than hell. That's improbable. But life is improbable. Our unredeemed state of being is improbable. Other things that's improbable is the burden that we are required to carry existentially. We are awake creatures of God. It means that we suffer. Not only we feel fear, frustration, disappointment. Even worst, we can apprehend the possibility of that recurring into the future. Even when none of those terrible things happen to be happening right now. We can imagine that will happen tomorrow, and they are going to happen. So, we're in a state of constant unredeemed suffering. A meta-state. A life that's predicated on constant death and renewal at every level of being. Predicated on a search for the truth. And an attempt to act out the truth. Associated with the sacrifice of self to God. Produces a state of being that's so deeply meaningful that it justifies suffering. It doesn't eliminate suffering. There's no elimination of suffering. Nietzsche said, "He who has a why can bear almost anyhow. If what you're aiming at is of sufficient profundity, it's worth an awful lot of misery to participate in the process of bringing it about." And life has an unbearable depth of misery. As a consequence, it needs an absurd positive aim. Is the participation in a process that transforms earth into heaven. The generation of the kingdom of God on earth. It means that the state of being that's described by the parameters. The willingness to engage in eternal sacrificial death and renewal. The sacrifice of the self to the highest value. Produces the state of being subjectively that's associated with habitation in the kingdom of God. And the actions in that state are what transform the interpersonal state into the political state that's a manifestation of that kingdom. You all know this. Because people just like you wrote the Bible, it's about people. When you have a deeply meaningful conversation with someone, that person changes and you change yourself as well, you know that. That's a mode of being. To the degree that is predicated on the attempt to communicate as truthfully as possible. And with the highest possible end in mind. Then right then and there, you're in that state. You can tell when you're in that state. Because you're not self-conscious, time disappears. And what you're engaged in is deeply meaningful. You don't bear the tragic burden of your life at that moment. Because what's happening with you is so worthwhile that it consumes you completely. And everyone is in it sometimes. Once you learn to notice it, you think, there's nothing better than that. And if there's nothing better than that, why do anything else? People can enter states of heaven and hell. They can learn to stay longer in one state or another. So why don't they stay in the best possible state? The first problem, it's the commitment of faith. It's terrifying to let go of the direction of your life and say, I'm going to go wherever the attempt to speak the truth will take me. Because God only knows where you are going to end up. And certainly not where you think. In fact, the willingness to abandon going where you think is a prerequisite for doing this. You're a ship that the wind takes wherever it wants to take. The second problem, it's a real responsibility. Because in order to undertake this process, you have to come to terms with the idea that what you do in your life, your wretched, miserable, tragic-prone life, actually matters, really it matters. People complain about meaninglessness in their life. That's a face-saving illusion. People are more afraid of meaning than they are of meaninglessness. Because it means, I can do whatever I want, it might be second-rate, dull, dangerous, destructive. But it doesn't matter, so I can do whatever I want to. I have no responsibility, because I don't mean anything. So I'm not responsible to anything or anyone. But, if your life actually has meaning, then you're responsible to a higher power. Responsible to your own soul. The state of being that characterized the world itself. Massive responsibility. Take responsibility for the sins of the world. One of the prerequisites for the mode of being described in the New Testament. The Redeemer takes on the sins of the world. It means, all human beings are Nazis, Maoist Red Guard, slaughterers in Rwanda. To realize what characterize the human capacity to turn earth into hell, characterize you. And to live properly. To need to live in a manner that addresses those elements of the nature. That's a terrible responsibility. Because at the end, 1 who wants to admit that. 2 who can stand looking at it. 3 who's going to take on the burden to solving it. Better be all of us, or we're just going to keep doing it. Redemption. We're not in a state of grace. Because we're self-conscious. Aware that we are the owners of the tragedy of our being. Unwilling to take full responsibility for it. Or we are ignorant about how to do that. That leaves us bereft. So, you might think, we can solve it with a state. But the state is not reliable. It degenerates into tyranny-chaos reconstitutes itself does the same thing. It's not a good answer. The second answer is on the New Testament. Is psychologically correct. Endless micro-death and renewal produces a state of proper adaptation to being. And the prerequisites for that are laid out in the narrative structure that underlies the New Testament are correct. To be redeemed is to aim at the highest value. To sacrifice what's no longer useful and valid in yourself and to tell the truth. The consequence of that is existence in a deep state of meaning. That justifies the tragedy of being. And the possibility of transforming your own life, in the most beneficial positive direction. While simultaneously doing that for people around you. And that's redemption. Thank you very much. To become self-aware is to wake up into a nightmare.